This story begins with paperwork, not public statements. In the Blake Lively lawsuit update, one of the earliest actions was a filing asking the court to keep certain documents out of public view. The filing listed text messages and written communications. It said they involved privacy and people who were not parties to the case. On its own, that request did not stand out. What mattered was when those documents were created. The documents marked for sealing came from several different points in time. They were not limited to one incident or one disagreement. They covered multiple months. Once those months are placed in order, a timeline starts to form. That timeline helps explain how the dispute grew. The sealed materials include messages from February, April, and May. These same months appear repeatedly in the Blake Lively legal update and the Justin Baldoni lawsuit update. When dates repeat like this, they usually mark turning points. Removing those messages makes the turning points harder to see. In February, messages discuss preparation for filming, recovery after childbirth, and how scenes would be scheduled. These messages later show up in arguments about comfort and boundaries. Some of them include references connected to Ryan Reynolds' news, because he is mentioned directly in the exchanges. These messages sit near the beginning of the disagreement, not at the end. In April, the focus shifts. Messages now involve intimacy coordination, creative input, and writing credit history. This is also when references tied to Taylor Swift Blake Lively appear. These messages come before the conflict becomes public. They matter because they show how influence and support were discussed early on. By May, the tone changes again. Messages now involve complaints, internal concerns, and questions about whether formal steps will be taken. This is when Wayfarer Studios starts appearing more often in the record. These communications happen just before editing disputes and filings related to summary judgment Lively Baldoni. This segment does not argue who is right or wrong. It explains order. The public court records show that the situation developed over time. It did not appear all at once. When messages from the middle of that process are sealed, later claims can feel sudden even if they were not. Understanding a case depends on seeing what happened first, what followed, and what changed. When pieces of that sequence are hidden, the picture becomes incomplete. This opening matters because it sets expectations. The case is not only about allegations and responses. It is also about access. What the public is allowed to read shapes how the dispute is understood long before the court reaches any final decision. The next part of the story focuses on who appears in the messages, not just what the messages say. In the Blake Lively lawsuit update, many sealing requests rely on the same explanation. Certain people mentioned in the texts are described as third parties. Because they are not formal parties in the case, their communications are argued to deserve privacy. Here is why that matters. Some of these so-called third parties appear at moments when decisions were being made. When messages from those moments are sealed, the public cannot see how discussions unfolded. The claims remain visible. The background does not. February is the first place this issue shows up clearly. Messages from that month deal with scheduling, recovery, and preparation for scenes. These texts later appear in arguments about comfort and boundaries. Some of them include references tied to Ryan Reynolds' news, which is one reason sealing is requested. But even if names are removed, the timing of the messages still matters. They sit near the start of the disagreement. April follows the same pattern. Messages now focus on intimacy coordination and creative input. This is also when references connected to Taylor Swift Blake Lively appear in the record. These texts are later discussed in filings about influence and support. The sealing argument again focuses on who is mentioned, not on when the conversation happened or how it later became relevant. By May, the scope widens. Messages now include internal concerns, studio awareness, and questions about whether formal action will be taken. This is where Wayfarer Studios begins to appear more often in the communications. These messages come just before editing disputes and more detailed filings in the Justin Baldoni lawsuit update. Here is the simple point. When messages from different months are hidden for the same reason, the middle of the timeline becomes harder to follow. The public can still see the end results. They just cannot see how those results were reached. This affects how people read the public court records. Courts look at order. They look at what happened first, what followed, and what changed. When parts of that order are missing, later actions can seem sudden or extreme, even if they develop slowly. This pattern becomes especially important in filings tied to summary judgment. Lively Baldoni. Summary judgment arguments focus on conclusions. Those conclusions make more sense when the full path is visible. When pieces of that path are sealed, readers argue about outcomes instead of causes. This segment does not decide whether sealing is right or wrong. It shows the effect. Each time the same privacy argument is used, another section of the timeline becomes harder to see. Over time, that removes much of the middle of the story. Understanding this helps explain why people come away with different impressions of the case. They are often working with different amounts of information. Some see the whole sequence. Others only see selected parts. That difference shapes opinions long before the court reaches a final ruling. The focus now moves to decisions made after filming was finished. The disagreement is no longer about how scenes were handled on set. It becomes about who has the power to decide what stays in the movie and what gets changed. In the Justin Baldoni lawsuit update, this shift appears when editing and approval discussions begin. The difference is clear. Early messages show cooperation. Later messages show limits. Messages from this period talk about editing access, approvals, and restrictions. They show who is allowed to give feedback and who is not. They also show when those limits are enforced. When these messages are sealed, the public can see the finished film but not how those decisions were made. Communication also changes at this point. Direct conversations happen less often. More messages go through representatives and intermediaries. Studio figures appear more frequently. Wayfarer Studios is mentioned in connection with Final Cut authority. Final Cut matters because it decides which version of the film is released. Messages from late April include requests to adjust the edit. Some of those requests are denied. The explanation given is contractual control. That means one side has the legal right to make the final call. These decisions explain why frustration grows later. When the messages explaining them are hidden, later disputes can look emotional instead of procedural. By mid-May, discussions shift again. Messages now mention private screenings and early feedback. Shortly after, conversations turn to conditions tied to promotion and participation. These discussions lead directly into arguments raised later in filings connected to summary judgment. Lively Baldoni. As June approaches, another set of issues appears. Messages now involve credit, marketing plans, and public presentation. This is where Ryan Reynolds' news shows up in a different way. Earlier mentions were personal. Now the focus is on visibility and promotion. These communications affect how the film is introduced to the public. Here is the simple idea. Editing choices, credit decisions, and promotion plans decide what people see and who speaks. When the messages that explain those choices are sealed, the public only sees the outcome, not the reasoning. This is not about deciding blame. It is about order of events. The public court records show that control did not arrive all at once. It increased step by step. Each decision built on the one before it. When the messages showing those steps are hidden, later actions can seem sudden or unfair. This section shows how authority shifts quietly. Once that shift happens, later decisions move faster and involve fewer voices. That explains why later filings feel sharper. The tension had been building for a while. It just becomes harder to see when key explanations are no longer available to the public. Attention now turns to what happened once the movie began moving toward release. Private disagreements start affecting public actions. Choices about promotion, appearances, and public silence become part of the dispute. These choices matter because they shape how the film is seen and who is seen with it. Messages from this period talk about press plans, premieres, and public events. They show who is expected to appear and who is not. Some people are included in interviews and screenings. Others are left out. When messages explaining these decisions are sealed, the public only sees the result, not the discussion behind it. This is where Ryan Reynolds' news becomes visible again, but in a different way. Earlier references were personal or private. Now the focus is on public presence, timing, and image. These discussions affect how the film is promoted and how attention is directed. Communication patterns also change. Direct conversations fade. More decisions move through agents, managers, and studio representatives. Wayfarer Studios appears more often in this role. This shows that control is being handled through formal channels rather than direct discussion. Messages from late June and July connect to these developments. They involve planning public appearances, managing reactions, and responding to outside attention. These conversations follow earlier disputes about editing and credit. That order is important. Public promotion reflects earlier private disagreements. Here is the simple logic. When people stop agreeing behind closed doors, it shows up in public behavior. If someone is missing from promotion, it usually connects to earlier decisions. When those earlier discussions are sealed, the public is left guessing. This matters when reading the public court records. The filings show that certain people were excluded from promotional activity. But without the messages that explain how that choice developed, the action can look abrupt or unfair. This segment does not judge motives. It explains how public actions follow private decisions. Promotion choices are not isolated events. They grow out of earlier conflicts, control issues, and limits that were already in place. As the case moves closer to hearings and rulings, these public moments draw more attention than anything else. They are easy to see and easy to react to, but they are also the final step in a longer chain of decisions. When parts of that chain are hidden, people focus only on the ending. That makes reactions stronger and opinions more divided. Some people see context. Others do not. Understanding this helps explain why public response becomes sharper at this point. The disagreement has been building quietly. Once it reaches the public, every action feels bigger, even if it came from decisions made much earlier. At this stage, the dispute begins to affect how blame is assigned. Because many earlier messages are sealed, later actions stand out more. People judge what they can see. When they cannot see the build-up, responsibility can look uneven. Here is the basic problem. When the beginning and middle of a story are hidden, the ending carries extra weight. Many sealed messages relate to credit, authorship, and contribution. These include discussions about who influenced the script, who had input during editing, and how that work would be recognized. In the Blake Lively legal update, these issues matter because they connect directly to claims about who shaped the final version of the film. When those discussions are sealed, the public sees the final credits but not the disagreements that came before. The same thing happens with escalation. Early messages show people trying to work things out. Over time, the language changes. Messages begin setting limits and conditions. These steps explain why relationships break down. When those steps are hidden, the breakdown appears sudden. This also affects how individuals are viewed. Ryan Reynolds' news appears at different points for different reasons. Early mentions relate to personal context. Later mentions relate to promotion and visibility. When parts of those discussions are sealed, the role can appear smaller or simpler than it was. Control also becomes clearer through the role of Wayfarer Studios. As disputes grow, decisions are handled more formally. Studio involvement increases. That explains why later choices feel fixed and difficult to reverse. Without seeing how that shift happened, outcomes can feel harsh instead of structured. This matters for how people read the public court records. Courts care about consistency over time. They look at patterns. When messages showing those patterns are missing, arguments rely more on summaries than direct evidence. That does not end the case, but it changes how claims are evaluated. This is especially clear in filings tied to summary judgment. Lively Baldoni. These filings focus on conclusions. Conclusions are easier to accept when the steps leading to them are visible. When those steps are sealed, people argue over results instead of causes. This segment does not argue that sealing is wrong. It explains the effect. One sealed message removes detail. Many sealed messages remove context. Over time, that changes how responsibility is understood. By now, later actions appear larger because earlier ones are harder to see. That does not mean the later actions came from nowhere. It means part of the story is missing. This helps explain why reactions to the case vary so widely. People are forming opinions based on different levels of access. Some see more of the story. Others see only the end. That difference matters as the case continues, because once blame is assigned in public opinion, it is difficult to undo, even if more information appears later. By the time the case reaches this point, the argument is no longer only about events. It becomes about what people are allowed to see. Many decisions have already been made. Some messages are public. Others are not. That difference shapes how the story is understood. Here is the simple reality. People judge a case using the information in front of them. When parts of the record are sealed, people fill in the gaps themselves. Across the case, the same pattern appears again and again. Early cooperation is partly visible. The moments where things start to change are harder to see. Later conflicts are clear. That makes the ending feel heavier than the beginning. This matters because courts and the public look for consistency. They want to understand how a situation developed. When messages explaining earlier decisions are missing, later actions look sharper and more dramatic than they may have been. That does not mean those actions were wrong. It means the full picture is harder to see. The public court records still show outcomes. They show who was excluded, who had control, and who made final decisions. What they do not always show is how those decisions were discussed step by step. When that middle layer is gone, conclusions arrive faster. This is not unique to this case. It happens whenever sealing removes context. The public focuses on what is visible. That focus shapes opinion long before any final ruling. At this stage, no judge has decided who wins or loses. No final order has resolved every issue. What has already happened, though, is quieter. The shape of the record has been set. What stays public and what stays hidden will guide how future arguments are read. That is why sequence still matters even near the end. Decisions do not appear out of thin air. They follow earlier choices. When those choices are hard to see, the story feels incomplete. This does not mean new facts will never appear. Courts can rule. Documents can be unsealed. But first impressions are powerful. Once people form an opinion, it is difficult to change it later. So the most important question is not only what the court will decide. It is how much of the path leading there remains visible. Because what people see now will influence how they understand everything that follows. If this breakdown was useful, the next phase of this story will matter even more. Because what follows rarely shows up in headlines. It appears in sequence, in timing, in what remains consistent once attention moves on. This isn't a moment that resolves all at once. It's one that continues to shift. And stories like this tend to reveal the most after certainty fades.